What is going on, everyone? Welcome to another very exciting episode right here on the MIgardener channel. In today's episode, we're going to talk about thinning, why you should thin and maybe why you shouldn't thin, when to thin, and other tips around thinning. Now, I do know that it's winter for us, or it's starting to become winter, and so we don't have a whole lot in our garden that's really needing to be thinned. Thinning typically takes place beginning of the gardening season or when you're first starting some crops and you're thinning them to give them the best chance at maturing to their fullest size. So I do know that because it's winter, we don't have a whole lot to thin in our garden, but I do have some crops behind me that could use a little thinning, and so I thought I would just use those as examples to kind of drive my point home, kind of point out some of those tips and tricks that I'm going to talk about. Now, the reason why I'm covering this video right now is not because I really had this on my planner, but it's because when I open up my inbox, you guys really dictate a lot of the content that I produce, and I love that about our community. We have so many gardeners in California, Florida, Arizona, New Mexico, even Australia that are just starting your gardens right now. So it kind of is, for me, I'm doing my community a disservice if I can talk about it and I don't talk about it. So rather than kind of stick with our normal winter style gardening content, we're going to do a quick transition, pretend like it's spring, and we're going to talk about thinning. And then for those of you that are experiencing the same weather that I am, just kind of keep this video in your back pocket, bookmark it, or save it to your playlist on YouTube, or share it to your Facebook page, something like that, so that you actually can reference it in the springtime, because the information won't change. It's just I really want to help out those that are asking for this information right now, because there is a lot of fear around thinning. There's a lot of fear about, I don't want to mess something up, or I don't want to kill my plants. And sometimes we can overcomplicate this process. At its foundation, thinning, just keep this in mind, thinning is a choice. You can make the choice to thin or not. Obviously, there are pros and cons to not thinning. The reason to thin, the justification to thin, is that you might have plants that are too crowded. And if your plants are too crowded, they're going to suffer from overcompetition from things like water, nutrients, sunlight, root space, or even airflow. And so having a lack of airflow can contribute to things like disease, increased pest pressure, and stuff like that. Too much crowding can reduce fruit yields on things like tomatoes and peppers and cucumbers. Your heavy fruiting plants, they need space because they're much bigger plants. Your root crops might not necessarily produce their full size because the actual root itself kind of pushes in on each other, and you end up with smaller roots. So you can have decreased yields through overcrowding. However, it is also a choice of yours to just let them go. And one benefit to letting them go, and again, we're going to talk about thinning, but I want to give you kind of both sides, because there's no right way to grow a garden. And I think a lot of people think you have to thin, but you don't always have to thin. In our case, with things like lettuce, we choose not to thin. The reason why we don't thin our lettuce is because we can grow more of it in a smaller amount of space. We don't grow for big, beautiful heads, we grow for leaves. So we've talked about, I think ad nauseum on this channel, maybe not ad nauseum, but I mean, we've talked a lot about how high intensity lettuce will yield 5 to 10 times more produce per square foot than if you grow it out for a head. And so with certain crops like leafy greens, they don't mind being crowded. And if you can grow them correctly, and you can really give them the right amount of nutrients, have the soil super fertile, keep them well watered, grow them in the right time of year when they're not going to be stressed, it can really help to make your garden more productive. So there are some reasons not to thin. But at its core, thinning is a choice. And the idea behind thinning is just to kind of reduce the competition and give each individual plant, the best chance at maturing to its fullest size, or to its biologic potential, as it's called. So with that in mind, coming in close, I want to show you kind of my thought process behind thinning. I'm going to show you what I do, and I'll also talk about the different stages that you can thin. Because I see so often in the comment section, Luke, when should I start thinning? And this is kind of an interesting topic for me, because thinning does not have a set time. Now, there are certain recommended times, but again, based on the crop you're growing, kind of dictates the time. It's not the same for every crop. So like if you're growing tomatoes, for instance, tomatoes for us are dead because it's basically winter. But just imagine we're growing a tomato plant. The sooner you can thin out any competition within about 1.5 to 2 feet, 2 square feet of another plant, right? Because that's the recommended spacing. 1.5 to 2 feet spacing per plant. So if you have a plant and a plant, well, the sooner you can thin out this plant, the better. Because that's going to ensure that that plant is going to get nice and large. The plant that you keep is going to be able to get nice and large. It's not going to compete for sunlight, airflow, nutrients, water. It's going to grow a whole lot faster, and the root system won't get intertangled either. Because sometimes the root system can actually cause damage to a healthier plant when it gets really mature and established. So the sooner you can thin, the better on those big fruiting plants. But with things like root crops, like I'll show you, some of your root crops you can actually weight. And what I love about weighting is that you can actually grow basically 2 crops in the same space, select one to harvest early, and then leave one to fully mature. All right, so I have some rutabagas right here, and then just next door I actually have some lettuce. And so a prime example of what I was talking about is this lettuce here. I will not thin this lettuce. I'm going to continue to let it grow and just basically let it kind of crowd itself out. I'll cut it for leaves, and I'll end up getting a whole lot more out of it if I harvest it for leaves rather than nice, beautiful heads of lettuce. But just next door, I have these rutabagas here. And these rutabagas are a root crop. And so you'll notice, obviously, if you look at these plants, you'll notice that the rutabagas are not all forming roots. Some are only forming tops and others are forming roots. The reason why that is because of overcrowding. Now, the benefit to me is that what I can do is I can actually come in here, I can let them just start producing. I can start them with a good spacing. So when I plant my seeds, in the very beginning, I plant my seeds, 2 seeds every 2 inches, if that makes sense. So 2 seeds, I'll space it out 2 more inches, I'll put 2 seeds. The reason why is because I'm already spacing them out 2 inches apart. And I might get 2 plants that grow right next to each other. But in the event that only 1 seed germinates, I don't have to thin that spot, and I can just basically let it go. But if you only plant 1 seed, wait 2 inches, or space it out 2 inches, plant 1 seed, space 2 inches, what happens if that 1 seed doesn't germinate? Now you have a big gap. So this way we have a nice continuous row of vegetables. However, you might need to come in and thin. Now what I like to do is I like to let them mature, find out which one is the healthiest, and then I'll thin from there. Because these root crops, they have plenty of time to mature. So in the in this example here, I have 2 right here. I don't know if you can see that or not, but I've got 2 rutabagas right here. One is starting to form, the other is a weakling. And I'm going to come in here and pull out the weakling. As you can see, this was not going to form a rutabaga because the other strongest one was already selected. Nature will kind of do this itself. You don't have to come in here as a gardener and thin right away. Now, I haven't done any thinning since planting these seeds. I'm letting nature select the strongest one, and once I see the strongest one, I'm then pruning out the weakest one. But you don't have to throw this out. You can actually eat this. And the nice thing is that you're actually going to be getting some beautiful leafy greens in the process. In this instance, you'll get some leafy greens to eat. But sometimes if it's radishes, it's just a smaller radish. It's still edible, it's just still a radish, but it's just smaller than the one you want to grow. And so you're actually getting kind of an earlier baby harvest, and you're letting something else grow to full fruition. So I will kind of come in here and pull out these less strong, the weaker of the bunch, so that I have the strongest that are going to produce. And that's how I thin things like root crops. Now, if it's things like heavy fruiting, things like tomatoes and peppers, I'll thin them very early. Or I will start them inside as a seedling and just plant the seedlings out 2 feet apart so you don't need to thin at all. Thinning mostly has to do with direct sowing seeds right in the ground. All right, the last kind of thinning is one that I kind of consider the dig up and manually space method. So in the other method, we were sacrificing a plant. We were selecting the weakest of the two or of the three of the bunch, and we were selecting those out to basically select the healthiest to survive. However, in some cases, you can select many plants to actually survive, but maybe they're just spaced too close together. Now, when I worked at a commercial greenhouse, we did this all the time. To save on space, we would take, a 3 or 4 inch pot, fill it with soil, load a bunch of seeds in there, let them germinate, and then we'd pull them out, soak them in water, soak the whole block in water, the whole, 4 inch pot. Soak that thing in water, tickle the root ball a little bit, and separate out the plants. Once you have them separated, you can actually manually space them out so that they have the correct spacing, but you're not sacrificing plants. Now, I love this method. This method works great for plants that are going to be in the garden for a long period of time. You can't necessarily do this with things like radishes, rutabagas. Your root crops are kind of tricky. The only exception to that are onions. We actually, I was planting out some bunching onions, and I accidentally dropped the entire packet. I'm sure this has probably happened to you. And the wind caught the packet and just flicked that out of my hand, and they all just spilled all over the ground. So rather than play pickup sticks with them, 100 or 200 onion seeds, I just said, well, it's like playing cards. The card laid is a card played. So I just said, hey, let's let fate take over. Let's see what happens. They did all sprout. And so they're all here, right? They're all here in a big bunch. You can dig them up, and onions separate very, very easily. In fact, you can go back and watch several of our onion planting videos, and you'll see me basically just pull out the plants. So I don't typically do this method with root crops, with the exception of onions. Onions they're very easy to do, but I will do this with things like peppers, tomatoes, eggplants. Your kind of sturdier plants that you can actually hold on to, separate out the roots, and then space them out manually. I love this method, like I said, because you're actually not killing a plant, but you are manually spacing out the plants so that they all can produce well. And I think that's kind of another good alternative that I thought I'd at least mention to all of you. So I hope you guys enjoyed. I hope you learned something new, and I hope you do try thinning. I know sometimes thinning is a daunting task, but I can say that if you follow this guide as kind of what to thin, maybe what you can not thin, what you can kind of leave and let go, and the times to thin. You don't have to thin right at the very beginning. You can let them go sometimes. You can dig them up and manually thin them. You have a lot of choices as a gardener, but thinning does overall lead to healthier, stronger, and less stressed plants. It leads to less pests, less disease, and overall better yields. So there are some serious benefits to thinning, and I would definitely highly recommend trying it. If you have any other questions, though, don't hesitate to post down in the comments box below. And as always, this is Luke from the MIgardener channel, reminding you to grow big or go home, and we'll catch you all later. See ya.